Denmark's silent resistance. How one nation saved 99% of its Jewish population. October 1943. The city of Copenhagen sits at the edge of a narrow strait, the Øresund, the strip of cold grey water that separates Denmark from Sweden. And on the far side of that water, visible on a clear day from the Danish shore, are the lights of Malmö. In the first days of October, the strait was dark, and the small fishing boats that put out from the Danish coast, from Dragør, from Rungsted, from Snekkersten, from Helsingør, from Gilleleje, from dozens of harbours up and down the Sound, were running without lights. They carried families in their holds. Children who had been told to stay quiet no matter what they heard. Mothers holding infants against their chests in the dark and the cold and the smell of diesel and fish. Elderly people who had not been told the whole truth about what was happening because the whole truth was too large to hold. The boats were mostly small, fishing cutters, pleasure craft, rowing boats, kayaks, whatever could be crewed and launched and pointed across the water in the dark. They were crewed by fishermen and students and doctors and priests and ordinary people who had no military training and no particular history of heroism, but who had heard that something was going to happen to their Jewish neighbours and had decided, without dramatic deliberation, that this was not something they were willing to watch. The crossing to Sweden was less than 15 miles at its narrowest. In the dark, in the cold, with German patrol craft somewhere on the water, it was long enough. In those first weeks of October, something happened in Denmark that had not happened anywhere else in occupied Europe, and that has not been fully explained or fully explained away in the 80 years since. A country under German occupation organized without central command, without a government directive, without an underground network that had years of preparation behind it, the rescue of more than 7,000 Jewish men, women and children, roughly 95% of the Danish Jewish population, and smuggled them across the water to neutral Sweden in a matter of days. Not all of them made it. Some were caught on the water, some were betrayed, some were too old or too sick or too terrified to make the crossing. Around 500 were deported to Theresienstadt in Bohemia. But the Danish government and the Danish Red Cross followed those 500 there, nagging and negotiating and demanding reports on their welfare, and of those 500, the great majority survived the war. The overall survival rate for Danish Jews was, by the end, somewhere between 97 and 99%. A figure so far outside the normal experience of occupied Europe that it has generated more than half a century of argument about what made it possible. This is that story. It is a story about a small country that did something extraordinary under occupation and about why it was able to do it. But it is also, underneath the heroism and the rescue boats, a stranger and more complicated story than the clean version allows. Because the Danish case is not simply a story about good people choosing to do the right thing. It is also a story about what happens when a German occupation policy goes wrong from the German side, about the specific and somewhat accidental conditions that put Denmark in a position no other occupied country shared, and about a single German official who may have saved more Jewish lives by breaking ranks than most of the population did by running boats in the dark. The rescue is real. The heroism is real. But to understand it honestly, you have to start not with the boats, but with the peculiar political arrangement that made the boats possible at all. And that arrangement began not in October 1943, but in April 1940, on the morning the Germans arrived. To understand what Denmark was, you have to understand what Denmark was not. Denmark was not Poland. It was not France. It was not Greece. It was not Yugoslavia. When the German army crossed the border in the early hours of the 9th of April 1940, it met resistance that lasted a matter of hours, some accounts say less than 2, before the Danish government accepted the German terms and ordered its soldiers to lay down their weapons. This is not a story that Danes have always been comfortable telling. The capitulation was fast, and in the context of what was happening to other countries, it was, at least on its face, deeply pragmatic. Denmark was a flat country with no defensible terrain, a tiny army, no allies within reach, and a government that had watched what happened to Poland when it fought back and had decided, with cold clarity, that fighting would mean total destruction for no strategic gain. So they surrendered on the morning of the first day, and in doing so, they preserved something that no other occupied country in Western Europe preserved: their own government, their own king, their own parliament, their own police, their own judicial system, their own newspapers for a while, their own daily life, modified but recognizable, continuing under German oversight rather than German rule. The arrangement the Germans offered Denmark was unlike anything they offered anyone else. And to understand why, you have to understand what Germany wanted from Denmark specifically. Denmark was not a military prize. It had no significant industry, no major port Germany urgently needed, no strategic depth. What it had was food. Denmark was one of the most productive agricultural countries in Europe, and a Germany planning for a long war needed Danish butter and Danish pork and Danish grain flowing into the Reich without interruption. Occupying Denmark in the conventional way, installing a military government, suppressing the population, running the country directly, would have been administratively expensive and might easily have disrupted exactly the agricultural cooperation Germany needed. So instead, the Germans made what was essentially a commercial arrangement dressed in the language of occupation. Denmark would supply food. Germany would exercise overall authority, but would leave the Danish government nominally in place and would not, at least initially, demand the things from Denmark that it was demanding from everyone else. For 3 years, this arrangement held. Danish farmers sent their produce east. The Danish government administered the country. The German presence was real, but, by the standards of occupied Europe, relatively light. Danish Jews, around 8,000 people, roughly 0.5% of the country's population, lived and worked as they had before. They were not required to register. They did not wear yellow stars. They were not subject to the exclusionary laws that had been imposed elsewhere. The Danish government had made clear from the beginning that it would not cooperate with anti-Jewish measures, and the German occupation authority had, for its own reasons, not pushed the point. This is the first thing that made Denmark different, and it is worth holding before moving on. Nowhere else in occupied Western Europe did a government remain in place and actively resist the persecution of its Jewish citizens as a matter of official policy. The Vichy government in France collaborated actively. The Dutch government was in exile in London. The Norwegian government was in exile in London. But the Danish government was in Copenhagen, meeting, functioning, and repeatedly telling the Germans, when the subject arose, that this particular demand was not one it would entertain. This was not heroism in the sense we usually use that word. It was diplomacy, it was bargaining, it was the careful management of an uncomfortable relationship with an occupier that had its own reasons for not pressing too hard. But the practical effect was the same. For 3 years, Danish Jews were protected not by hiding, but by the continued existence of a functioning Danish state that included them as citizens. That protection ended in the summer of 1943, and it ended because the underlying arrangement was always unstable, and by that summer it had become intolerable to the German side. The war was going badly. The Wehrmacht had been defeated at Stalingrad. The Allied invasion of Sicily had begun. German demands on Denmark had increased: more food, more labor, more political compliance, and the Danish population had begun pushing back in ways that were impossible to ignore. There were strikes. There were acts of sabotage, carried out by small but growing resistance networks. There were incidents in which Danish workers refused German orders. The SS, which had always viewed the Danish arrangement with impatience bordering on contempt, argued that this coddled protectorate needed to be brought into line. In late August 1943, the German military declared a state of emergency. The Danish government refused to accept the conditions attached to lifting it and, in effect, resigned. The Germans interned the Danish army and took direct control. The 3-year arrangement was over, and with it, the protection of Danish Jews was over, because the political shield that had kept German anti-Jewish measures away from Denmark was gone, and the SS intended to fill the resulting vacuum immediately. It is worth pausing here on what those 3 years of occupation had actually looked like for ordinary Danish Jews, because that texture matters for everything that follows. The 8,000 Jews in Denmark in 1940 were, by and large, a population that was deeply integrated into Danish civic and professional life. They were doctors, lawyers, merchants, academics, craftsmen, shopkeepers. Many of their families had been in Denmark for generations. The oldest continuous Jewish community in Scandinavia traced its roots to the 17th century, when Christian IV had invited Sephardic Jews to settle in his kingdom. Others had come more recently, refugees from Eastern European persecution in the early 20th century, who had arrived and integrated and whose children had grown up as Danes who happened to be Jewish. There was a small but established community in Copenhagen with its own institutions: the Great Synagogue, the Jewish Community Organization, a school, welfare associations, but these were not institutions that separated their members from Danish society. They were the infrastructure of a minority that participated fully in the majority society around it. Under German occupation, that participation had continued. There were no yellow stars in Denmark. There were no curfews specific to Jews. Jewish children attended the same schools as their non-Jewish neighbours. Jewish doctors treated non-Jewish patients. Jewish businesses operated alongside Danish businesses. The exclusions and humiliations and legal degradations that elsewhere in occupied Europe had spent years teaching non-Jewish populations to see their Jewish neighbours as a different kind of person had simply not happened in Denmark. This was not accidental. The Danish government had drawn a clear line from the beginning. It would cooperate in many things, but it would not cooperate in the persecution of Danish citizens. And it had communicated this so clearly and had backed it with enough political will and institutional resistance that the German occupation authority had, for its own reasons, chosen not to force the issue. The result was 3 years in which Danish Jews were not gradually stripped of their humanity in the public eye, not gradually made strange to the people around them, not gradually reduced in the daily experience of ordinary Danes from neighbours into abstractions. When October came, they were still people you knew. That is not a small thing. There was an older man, a retired physician, who lived on the same street in Copenhagen as a fishmonger named Thorvald. They had been nodding acquaintances for 15 years, the kind of relationship that a city street produces. A greeting in the morning, a word about the weather, an occasional conversation about nothing in particular. When the warning spread through the neighborhood in the first days of October, Thorvald appeared at the physician's door and told him there was a boat leaving from Dragør the following night and that there was room for him and his wife. He did not make a speech. He did not perform heroism. He said there was a boat. The physician later said, in an account collected after the war, that he had not known until that moment how frightened he had been. He had been trying not to know. Thorvald's appearance at his door with the simple information that there was a boat was, he said, the most important thing anyone had ever done for him. Thorvald, when asked about it decades later, said he had done what any decent person would have done, and that he did not understand why anyone thought it was remarkable. The gap between those two descriptions of the same act is one of the central mysteries of Denmark in October 1943. The man assigned to organize the deportation of Danish Jews was a senior SS official named Werner, who was the German Reichsplenipotentiary in Denmark, the highest German civilian authority in the country. Best is one of the most troubling figures in this story, and to understand what happened next, you have to look at him carefully and resist the temptation to make him simple. He was not a good man. He was a committed Nazi ideologue, and a senior SS officer with a long record of complicity in German crimes across occupied Europe. He was not a rescuer. He was not, in any straightforward sense, a man of conscience. But he was also, by the autumn of 1943, a German official who understood that the occupation of Denmark had worked up to a point precisely because Denmark had been handled differently from everywhere else, and who was calculating, coolly, professionally, in a way that mixed whatever private reservations he may have had with a careful reading of his own political position, that a violent mass deportation of Danish Jews would be a catastrophic mistake for German interests in Denmark. And so Werner did something that no equivalent German official in any other occupied country had done. He told the Danish government what was coming. The warning did not come directly. It came through a German diplomat named Georg Ferdinand Duckwitz, who was attached to Best's office and who has generally been given the credit for what followed. On the 28th of September 1943, Duckwitz met with Danish Social Democratic leaders and told them that the deportation of Danish Jews had been ordered, that the roundup was set for the night of the 1st to the 2nd of October, and that the Germans planned to use ships moored in the Copenhagen harbour to carry the deportees away. Duckwitz had also, in the days before this meeting, taken a step that went beyond merely warning the Danes. He had travelled to Stockholm and met with Swedish officials to establish that Sweden would accept refugees if they arrived, an assurance that was not, at that point, formally on record. He had done what he could, from inside the German apparatus, to ensure that both the warning and its destination were in place before the clock ran out. Whether he acted with Best's knowledge or in spite of it is a question the record does not fully answer. What is certain is that the warning reached Danish hands, and that Danish hands passed it further with extraordinary speed. There has been argument about exactly how much Best knew Duckwitz would do, about whether the leak was sanctioned or unauthorized, about whether Best's later claim to have intended to help the Jews was a retrospective, self-serving reinterpretation of events or something real. These arguments are not fully resolvable. What is not arguable is that Best requested from Berlin a smaller German police force than the roundup would actually require. A request that, if he had genuinely wanted the deportation to succeed, makes no sense. He telegraphed Berlin on the 2nd of October after the failed roundup, noting that despite the fact that most Danish Jews had gone into hiding, the action had been carried out and could be considered complete. This was not how a man who wanted to deport 8,000 people described a failure to deport 7,000 of them. It was how a man described what he needed Berlin to believe had happened while the boats were still crossing. His motives remain opaque. The result does not. What happened in those days has no real parallel in the history of the occupation. The Social Democratic leaders who received the warning told their own networks. The information moved through Copenhagen's Jewish community, through synagogues, through community organizations, through informal personal connections. It moved through the medical community. Doctors at the Bispebjerg Hospital, one of Copenhagen's main hospitals, became a crucial node in the rescue operation that followed, using the hospital as a staging and organizing point. It moved through the churches. The Bishop of Copenhagen, H.F. Fuglsang Damgaard, had a letter read from pulpits across the city on the 1st of October, the same night the Germans came to collect, stating that the church could not remain silent while its neighbours were threatened. The Danish resistance, such as it was in the early days of October 1943, was not a coordinated organization, but a loose collection of cells and individuals with varying degrees of connection to each other. They were not the ones who primarily organized the rescue. The rescue was organized by civilians, by doctors and fishermen and students and shopkeepers, and people who had a Jewish neighbor or a Jewish colleague or a Jewish acquaintance, and who heard that something was about to happen and called around to ask who needed help. The German roundup on the night of the 1st to the 2nd of October was, by German standards in occupied Europe, a failure so complete that it has generated considerable historical analysis. the Germans went to the addresses they had, drawn presumably from whatever records they could find, and found, in most cases, no one home. The Jewish population of Copenhagen had, in the space of a few days, largely gone to ground, hidden by neighbours and strangers in apartments, in hospital beds, in churches, in country houses, in the basements of institutions. Of the roughly 8,000 Jews in Denmark, the Germans caught fewer than 300 in that first sweep. It was a humiliation, and it pointed directly to the problem the rescuers now faced. The people they were hiding could not stay hidden indefinitely, and the only viable destination was Sweden. Sweden had declared its neutrality in 1939 and had been maintaining it under considerable pressure, making economic concessions to Germany that its critics considered collaborationist while resisting the most direct German demands. By late 1943, as the military balance shifted, Sweden had quietly indicated that it would accept Danish Jewish refugees, but quietly was the operative word. There was no official Swedish announcement, no diplomatic protocol, no organized reception structure waiting on the other side. There was simply a neutral country 11 to 15 miles across the water, and a Swedish government that was not going to send its navy to stop boats full of refugees. On the Danish side, there was a coastline, fishing harbours, boat owners, and a great deal of organized improvisation. The people organizing the departures were mostly not resistance fighters. They were students from Copenhagen University who had quickly formed ad hoc networks. They were fishermen who had been approached, many of them, by people they knew, and who had to decide in the space of a conversation whether they were going to say yes. Some of them refused, more said yes. The logistics were complicated by money, by geography, by time pressure, and by the Germans. Money was a serious problem. Getting a boat across the Øresund cost money. The fishermen who risked their livelihoods and potentially their freedom were not doing it as charity, or not most of them, and the fees charged varied from the modest to the extortionate. Jewish community organizations and wealthy Danish donors contributed funds. Hospitals and institutions collected money. Some families paid everything they had. Some families were helped by strangers who handed over cash without asking for anything in return. The accounts of those crossings are full of moments of both generosity and exploitation, and the history has to hold both. Not every Dane was a hero in those days, and pretending otherwise would be false to the people who were. The crossings themselves were physically dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with the Germans. The Øresund in early October is cold and can be rough, and the boats being used were not passenger vessels. People were hidden in fish holds, in engine rooms, under tarpaulins. Children were sedated with drugs, in some accounts with preparations that were barely tested, improvised by doctors working with what they had, to prevent them from crying out if a German patrol came near. The boats ran without lights. Some ran aground. Some were boarded by German patrol craft and their passengers arrested. The Swedish Coast Guard watched from the other side, not intervening, waiting to see what arrived. When the boats did reach Swedish territorial water, they were met, and the refugees were brought ashore and processed through a system that was making itself up as it went. The town of Gilleleje on the northern coast of Zealand became, for a few extraordinary days, one of the main embarkation points, and what happened there illuminates both the generosity and the fragility of the rescue operation. Hundreds of people converged on the town, far more than the local fishing fleet could carry in a single night. They were hidden in houses and in the church attic, which filled until there was barely room to breathe. A fishing captain named Henry Thompson organized a schedule of departures over several nights, matching people to boats and boats to departure times with the methodical efficiency of a man who was very frightened and could not afford to show it. On the night of the 6th of October, the church attic was betrayed, by who has never been fully established, and 83 Jews hiding there were arrested by the Gestapo and eventually sent to Theresienstadt. The fishermen who had been preparing to take them across slipped away into the dark. The town was devastated by what had happened. Within days, the rescues from Gilleleje resumed. The betrayal had not stopped the operation. It had only changed which boats ran on which nights. The student networks operating out of Copenhagen deserve their own account. A group of medical students at the University of Copenhagen, most of them in their early 20s, had formed an improvised organization in the first days of October that was doing more or less everything at once, receiving families who arrived at the university campus having nowhere else to go, finding hiding places in the city, making contact with fishermen along the coast, collecting money from donors, moving people in small groups by train and by bicycle and on foot to the departure points, and managing the 1,000 operational details that keep an improvised rescue from collapsing under its own weight. A young woman named Ebba Lund, who became one of the central figures in the Snekkersten operation along the northern coast, was 22 years old when she coordinated dozens of crossings over the course of 2 weeks. She carried messages between the boat operators and the hiding families, arranged departures, talked down people who had reached the edge of panic, and did it all on a bicycle on the dark roads of a country that had German soldiers in it. She was not the only one. There were dozens of people like her, mostly young, mostly without any prior experience of anything like what they were doing, who improvised a rescue operation out of nothing and who, by the end of October, had gotten most of a community across to safety. The German response to all of this was, by the standards of what German forces did elsewhere in Europe, notably restrained. The Gestapo made arrests. German naval patrol boats were on the water. Some boats were caught, but the full weight of the German security apparatus was not deployed to stop the crossings in the way that it could have been, and the reasons for this have been argued about ever since. Some historians point back to Best and suggest that his calculation that a violent crackdown would be more trouble than it was worth for German interests in Denmark extended even to the boat crossings. Others have pointed to the sheer logistical impossibility of patrolling a long and irregular coastline at night against determined civilians using dozens of different departure points. Still others have noted that the German Navy, which controlled the approaches, had its own institutional culture and interests and was not simply an extension of SS policy. Whatever the precise combination of reasons, the result was that the crossings continued and most of them got through. The people who did not get through, the roughly 500 who were caught and deported to the concentration camp at Theresienstadt in Bohemia, are the part of the story that the rescue narrative sometimes skips past too quickly. Theresienstadt was not Auschwitz. It was a camp designed partly as a showplace, a model ghetto that the Nazis could point to when the Red Cross or international opinion demanded evidence that Jews were being well treated. Conditions there were brutal by any ordinary standard: overcrowding, hunger, disease, forced labor, but the gas chambers were elsewhere, and the Theresienstadt inmates were at least alive while the war continued, and a decision was made about what to do with them. The Danish Jews who arrived there were, almost immediately, the subject of official Danish concern. The Danish government, such as it was in the absence of the government that had resigned in August, and Danish institutions began a persistent campaign to keep track of them, to demand access to them, to send parcels and supplies to ensure that they were not quietly removed to the east. The Danish Red Cross negotiated a visit to Theresienstadt in June 1944, the same inspection that the Nazis used as propaganda, staging an elaborate Potemkin performance for the international observers. And while that visit was largely a fraud, the Danish pressure it represented kept the Danish deportees visible and, to some degree, shielded. Of the roughly 500 Danes sent to Theresienstadt, approximately 50 died there. Most of the rest came home in late April 1945, evacuated by the Swedish Red Cross in a convoy organized by Folke Bernadotte. The details of what it meant to be a Danish Jew in Theresienstadt are worth dwelling on, because they illustrate something important about what continued institutional concern can actually accomplish inside a system designed to make concern impossible. The 500 Danes arrived in the camp to find that they were, in a sense, known quantities, a cohort that a neutral country was tracking by name, whose welfare a functioning national institution was demanding to verify. Other inmates were anonymous to the outside world, people whose disappearance could be arranged without consequences. The Danish deportees were not anonymous. When the Red Cross inspectors arrived for that June 1944 visit, they specifically requested access to the Danish contingent and received reports on the condition of individuals by name. The reports they received were manipulated, and the camp was staged for their benefit. The Nazis planted window boxes full of flowers, redirected food distributions to make the place look fed, staged performances and activities to suggest a functioning community rather than a holding pen. But the Danish government received those reports and continued to send parcels and continued to ask questions. The persistence was annoying to the German administration in a way that had practical effects. It was harder to quietly transfer the Danish Jews east to the gas chambers while Denmark kept asking about each of them by name. Not impossible, but harder. That difficulty, accumulated over months, was enough to keep most of them alive until the war ended and the Swedish Red Cross convoy came for them. The question that historians have been arguing about since the 1960s is the question the story keeps circling back to. What made Denmark different? The clean answer, the one that fits most naturally on a commemorative plaque, is that the Danish people were more humane, more courageous, more resistant to Nazi ideology than the populations of other occupied countries, and that this moral superiority expressed itself in action when the test came. This answer is not entirely wrong and is not entirely sufficient. The Danes did act, and many of them acted with genuine and admirable courage, but the conditions that made their action possible were not replicated elsewhere. And to say simply that other populations were less brave or less good is to avoid the harder question of what specifically Denmark had that other countries lacked. The Danish political scientist and historian Gilleleje, who wrote the most thorough early account of the rescue, argued that the key factor was the prior 3 years of relative normalcy, the fact that Danish Jews had not been systematically humiliated, isolated, impoverished and marked as outsiders in the way that Jewish communities in Poland, France and the Netherlands had been before the deportations began. In those countries, years of anti-Jewish legislation had done the work of separating Jewish citizens from their non-Jewish neighbours, making the Jews strange, making their persecution seem like something that was happening to a different kind of person. In Denmark, none of that intermediate work had been done. Danish Jews were fully integrated into Danish society. They were colleagues, employers, neighbours, friends. When the threat came for them, it came suddenly. It came for people who were known and embedded in the community. And it came too fast for the gradual process of psychological separation to have had any effect. The neighbours who hid them and the fishermen who crossed the Sound with them were, in many cases, helping people they actually knew. That is not the same thing as abstract moral principle, and it may be more important. Hannah Arendt, writing about the Eichmann trial in 1963, used the Danish case to make a different but related point. Arendt argued that what distinguished Denmark was not primarily the individual courage of its citizens, but the existence of a functioning institutional and political structure. A state, however compromised, that had not participated in isolating its Jewish minority, and that had therefore preserved the social fabric within which individual action was possible. When Eichmann's machinery was deployed against Denmark, it met a population whose leaders, at every level, from cabinet ministers to hospital administrators to church pastors, had not been complicit in the preparatory steps, and who therefore had no psychological or institutional investment in the outcome the Germans were trying to produce. You cannot rescue people from a process you have helped prepare. In Denmark, no one had helped prepare it. Arendt's argument was not entirely welcome in Denmark when it was made. The clean version of the story, the one about Danish goodness and Danish values, and the moral superiority that expressed itself in the boats was already established by 1963, and Arendt's insistence on the structural explanation felt, to some Danish readers, like a diminishment of what their countrymen had done. It is not a diminishment. Arendt was not saying that the courage was fake or that the individual choices did not matter. She was saying that courage and choice do not operate in a vacuum, that people act within structures that either enable or foreclose particular kinds of action, and that Denmark had structures in October 1943 that other countries lacked. This is true. It is also true that the same structures were present in Norway, which was occupied at the same time and which had its own Norwegian Jewish community, and which did not, as a whole, produce a comparable rescue response. The structures mattered. They did not determine everything. The individuals who chose to act within those structures made their choices freely, and other individuals in similarly structured societies made different choices, and the difference between those two outcomes belongs to the people who made the choices rather than to the structures alone. The third element, the one that the celebratory version of the story is most reluctant to examine directly, is the role of Werner and the German occupation authority in allowing the rescue to happen. The warning that Duckwitz delivered did not come from nowhere. It came from inside the German apparatus in Denmark, and it is very difficult, reading the historical record, to avoid the conclusion that Best at minimum tolerated and possibly engineered the conditions that made the rescue possible. Best was tried by a Danish court after the war for his record as German plenipotentiary and was initially sentenced to death, a sentence that was subsequently commuted, and then, in a sequence of legal proceedings that became scandalous in Denmark, reduced to a term of imprisonment, and then, eventually, to his release. His defenders argued that he had saved the Danish Jews. His prosecutors argued that he had organized the deportation of those who were caught and had done far worse things in other capacities. Both of those things were true simultaneously, and it is uncomfortable to sit with them. The rescue of Danish Jews was, among other things, the result of a German official's calculation that his interests were best served by allowing it, and whatever personal element there was in that calculation remains opaque, as it probably should, because Best did not leave a reliable account of his own motivations and was hardly a disinterested witness to his own history. None of this diminishes what the Danish people did in those October days. The doctors who organized hiding places, the fishermen who took the money and crossed the Sound, the students who ran the shoreside networks, checking papers, moving families, managing the chaos of a rescue operation that was being made up in real time. The people who turned up at the homes of neighbors they barely knew and said simply that there was a boat and there was room and that they needed to come now. The woman, there were many such women who walked into a hospital and announced that she would hide anyone who needed hiding and who spent the next weeks sleeping 4 hours a night while her apartment turned into a way station. The fisherman who made the crossing a dozen times, who developed a routine out of what began as a single act of decision, who got tired and frightened and did it anyway. These people were real, and what they did was real, and the relative normalcy of the conditions that made it possible does not subtract from the fact that they chose to act when they could have chosen not to. What is perhaps most important to hold is that the rescue was not the result of a plan. There was no organization at the beginning of October 1943 that could have organized it. The Danish resistance did not direct it. The Danish government had not prepared for it. It happened because information moved faster than the German machinery could move, because the social connections between the Jewish and non-Jewish communities were intact enough that information translated quickly into action, and because enough people individually decided in the first 48 hours that they were going to help, that the thing became self-organizing. It was, in the language that social scientists would use later, an emergent phenomenon, a response that was larger and more rapid and more effective than any individual actor had designed, that arose from a particular social and political environment, that happened to be configured at that particular moment in a way that made large-scale civic action possible. That does not happen everywhere. It did not happen everywhere. And the question of why it happened in Denmark and not elsewhere is not a question with a comfortable answer, because the answer implicates not just Danish courage, but Danish luck, German calculations, Swedish neutrality, and the specific institutional and social history of a small country that had handled occupation differently from the beginning. The people who were rescued came home after the war to a country that had kept their businesses, their apartments, their belongings, kept them in a way that had no parallel in occupied Europe, where returning Jewish survivors typically found their property stolen, their apartments occupied, their lives dismantled. The Danish government had explicitly maintained the property rights of absent Jewish citizens, assigning caretakers to their businesses, holding their possessions. The homecoming was not without difficulty. There were tensions, some property disputes, some adjustment after years of absence. But it was a homecoming to a place that had, in a real sense, tried to hold a space for the people who had left. That, too, was without parallel. What that homecoming actually looked like, in individual terms, is worth spending a moment with. A woman who had crossed the Sound in October 1943 with her two daughters, aged 7 and 9, came back to her apartment in Copenhagen in May 1945 to find that her neighbour had been paying the rent during her absence and had kept her furniture dusted. There was a note on the table. It said, simply, that her plants had been watered and that there was bread. In the Netherlands, Jewish survivors coming home found their apartments emptied and often occupied by strangers who had legal paperwork for the furniture they had taken. In France, returning survivors frequently had to fight long legal battles to recover property that had been transferred during the occupation. In Denmark, the machinery of preservation had been running, imperfectly but consistently, for the entire duration of their absence. The scale of what this meant, for dignity, for the practical possibility of rebuilding a life, was something the returnees understood immediately and that the rest of Europe, looking on, had no equivalent context for. You cannot keep a people's property safe without first deciding that they are a people who will return. The Danish decision to maintain Jewish property was, among other things, a statement about how the occupation's end was expected to look. A statement made years before anyone could be certain that the occupation would have an end. Duckwitz survived the war, returned to a diplomatic career in the new West German state, and was eventually named German ambassador to Denmark. He was honored by Israel as a righteous among the nations in 1971. Werner survived a complicated post-war legal trajectory and died in 1989 in West Germany, having successfully argued, in the end, for a version of his own history that emphasized the rescue. The Danish fishermen and students and doctors and neighbours who ran the boats returned to their ordinary lives. Most of them, and for many years, were reluctant to speak about what they had done. The reticence was partly cultural, Scandinavian understatement, the tradition that you do not call attention to good deeds, and partly something more specific to the experience. What they had done had felt, in the moment, not like heroism, but like the obvious thing to do, the only thing to do, what any decent person would have done. The fact that, across most of occupied Europe, decent people had not done it, that the obvious thing to do had turned out to be the exceptional thing, was something many of them were not sure how to hold. The Jewish community in Denmark today is small, continuous with the community that came home in 1945, shaped by the experience of October in ways that are hard to fully articulate. The boats that cross the Sound are part of the national story in a way that is unusual, commemorated, studied, argued over, but not mythologized in the sense of having been cleaned up and simplified past recognition. The Danes know that not everyone helped. They know about the people who charged too much for the crossing, the informers who existed at the margins of the story, the institutional actors whose motives were mixed. They know about Werner. The fact that the story resists the clean version is part of what makes it, in the end, more instructive than the clean version would be. It is also worth spending a moment on what the 7,000 people who made it to Sweden actually built there in the months between October 1943 and the end of the war, because it is a part of the story that the rescue narrative tends to end too early. Sweden had accepted them as refugees, but it had not accepted them as permanent residents. The clear expectation on both sides was that they would return to Denmark when the war ended, and that their stay in Sweden was temporary. They settled in and around Malmö, and in Stockholm and other Swedish cities, and they organized. They organized schools for the children. They organized community welfare for the elderly. They organized professional associations and kept their networks of connection alive across the narrow stretch of water from which they had come. Danish Jewish doctors practiced in Swedish hospitals. Danish Jewish teachers taught in Swedish schools. The community did not disintegrate during its exile. It sustained itself, actively and deliberately, in the expectation of return. And when the return came, in the spring of 1945, it came to a country that had tried to keep a place for them, and the community they had maintained in exile fitted back into the shape that had been held for it in a way that was, by any historical comparison, remarkable. Because the point is not that the Danes were simply better people. The point is that specific conditions, social, political, institutional, historical, made large-scale rescue possible in Denmark when it was not possible elsewhere, and that the question worth sitting with is which of those conditions can be replicated and which cannot. The social integration of the Jewish community before the occupation. The existence of a government that had refused, from the beginning, to participate in their persecution. The warning that came from inside the occupying authority. The proximity of a neutral country willing to receive refugees. The compressed timeline that allowed no preparatory process of dehumanization. Take any one of those elements away and the story is different. Add all of them together in the right configuration at the right moment, and 7,000 people crossed a dark strait in fishing boats and came out alive on the other side. There is something else in the Danish case that gets less attention than the rescue itself, and it is worth naming before the story ends. The Danish population did not merely help Jews escape. It also, in the months and years that followed, October 1943 maintained its memory of what had happened in a way that refused to let the rescue become merely a source of national self-congratulation. The arguments that Danes have continued to have with themselves about Werner, about the fishermen who charged high prices, about the informers, about the question of whether Danish exceptionalism was moral or accidental, are arguments that reflect a kind of civic honesty that is itself not easy to maintain. Cultures that have done something good often prefer to remember the good thing and not the complications around it. Denmark has managed, imperfectly but persistently, to remember both. That persistence, the refusal to simplify the story into a myth that can be worn comfortably, is perhaps its own form of the same civic integrity that produced the boats in the first place. A community that tells an honest story about itself is a community that knows what it actually is, as opposed to what it would prefer to believe. That knowledge is harder to sustain than the heroic version. It is also more useful. The boats are still talked about in the towns along the Sound. Some of the harbours from which they sailed are marked. The Øresund is narrow enough that on a clear day you can see Sweden from the Danish shore, a low smudge of land across the water, very close. Close enough to seem reachable, close enough that on a still October night in 1943 it was reachable, if you had a boat and someone willing to crew it and the nerve to run dark across 15 miles of cold water with everything you owned and everyone you loved, packed into the hold beneath your feet. Most of the people who made that crossing lived. Most of the people who helped them across went back to ordinary lives and did not consider themselves heroes. Both of those facts are extraordinary, and neither of them fully explains the other. If this story stayed with you, I would like to hear your thoughts in the comments. The rescue of Danish Jews is often held up as the great example of what is possible under occupation, but historians genuinely argue about what made it possible and whether the conditions could ever be reproduced. So I will put the question to you directly. Was what happened in Denmark in October 1943 a story about the exceptional courage of a particular people? Or was it a story about the specific political, social, and historical conditions that happened to converge at a particular moment, conditions that other countries did not share? Tell me where you land and tell me why. I read every comment, and on this one I genuinely want to know what you think. Subscribe for the next chapter in the history of occupied Europe. If this video found you, leave a like so it finds the next person too. Now, watch this next video. CO description. In October 1943, something happened in Denmark that had not happened anywhere else in occupied Europe. When the Nazi deportation order came for Denmark's 8,000 Jewish men, women and children, ordinary Danes, doctors, fishermen, students, neighbours, organized a spontaneous rescue operation that smuggled roughly 95% of the country's Jewish population across 15 miles of cold water to neutral Sweden in a matter of days. The survival rate for Danish Jews by the end of the war was between 97 and 99%. No other occupied country in Europe came close. This is the complete story of how it happened and why it happened in Denmark and nowhere else. We follow the 3 years of protected occupation that kept Danish Jews integrated into their communities, the collapse of that arrangement in August 1943, the warning delivered by a German diplomat that set the rescue in motion, the improvised boat network that crossed the Øresund in the dark, and the 500 who were caught and sent to Theresienstadt whom Denmark refused to abandon. And we sit honestly with the question historians still argue about: was Denmark's rescue a story about the exceptional moral character of its people, or about the very specific political, social, and historical conditions that no other occupied country shared? Keywords: Denmark Jewish rescue, Danish resistance. W. Towns, October 1943. Denmark, Øresund crossing. Jews, Georg Duckwitz's warning, Werner best Denmark, Danish Jews saved, rescue. Danish Jews boats, Theresienstadt. Danish Jews, Operation 1943. Denmark, Copenhagen. Jewish community, righteous among nations. Denmark, W. Kauze. Occupation, Denmark, Hannah Arendt. Denmark, Eichmann, Denmark. 99% Nordic resistance. W. Mauser, Jewish rescue occupied Europe, Bispebjerg Hospital. Rescue, Denmark, Sweden. Refugees 1943, Folke Bernadotte, Sweden, WWASR. Denmark documentary, Danish fishermen rescue, Lene Yahil, Denmark, Nazi occupation Denmark, occupied, Europe Jewish survival.